So we're going to begin this section by seeing how to import maps into our apps. And it's reasonably straightforward, but there are a couple of little niggles in the process, particularly when you're working with the emulator. So do follow along very carefully. Firstly, we have something new to do when we create our new project. So I'll call it Maps Demo. That's all the same as before, but the main change here is that we're going to switch down to API 21. And that's because at the time of making this video, there's an issue with API 22 and the emulator and working with maps. It won't change anything with our code or anything like that. It just means that maps will work on the simulator. So make sure you select that one. And then for once, we're not going to choose the blank activity, but we're going to use the Google Maps activity. That's going to give us all the kind of boilerplate code that we'll need to use Google Maps. And then we leave everything else the same. Now you will need a Google account for this one. So if you haven't got one, then just nip off and create one very quickly. You're going to need one for submitting your apps to Google Play or doing a bunch of other things that we're going to be working with in the next few lectures anyway. So it's definitely a necessity, and of course it's completely free. And here we go. You can see that the first difference is that instead of being given a template of the app to work with, we're faced with Google Maps API.xml, which is in the values folder, which we haven't really looked at yet. So the values folder is generally a place to store data that you might want to use throughout your app. Strings.xml, for example, is used to store translation data. So if you want your app to work with a number of languages, you can store the different strings for, say, click here in the different languages that you want to support. But we're of course going to focus on this one, and all the instructions are right here in front of you, which is very handy. So essentially what we need to do is to create a Google Maps API key, which allows us to use this particular app with Google Maps. So all you need to do, as the instructions say, is copy that big long link there, and then go over to your browser and paste the link in. So I've got the Google Developers site here, but we don't need to go to there. We can just paste the whole link straight in from wherever you are. And then you just leave that as create a new project, click continue, and then it will generate a new API key for you just down here. It takes a few seconds. And then all we'll do is paste that API key in our app, and then our app will, with any luck, work with Google Maps. So there we go. So now we need our API credentials. Let's go over to them and click create. There we go. So there's the API key. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend using my one. It will probably be disabled by the time you're watching this video anyway, but you should use your own. There we go. All you need to do is paste it in there. And then let's have a quick look at what the rest of the app looks like. So if we go to our activity maps, which is, so it's not activity main anymore, it's activity maps. And we've got something called a fragment here. So a fragment is a kind of generic layout type or user interface type, which is what the maps go in. If you've had a look down here, you notice that there's no kind of map view that we can drag in. Instead, we use this thing called a fragment, which then is switched by Google to work with Google Maps. So there's our maps fragment. And then finally, in our activity maps activity.java file, got some code which we'll just have a quick look at before we run the app to see what it looks like. So you can see we've got our Google Map mmap, which is going to link to the fragment on our app. And then on create here, we've got setup map if needed. And we've got a new method that we haven't seen before, on resume. So this is run if the app is put into the background and then brought to the front again, but never completely closed. So once again, that just sets up the map so it's correctly displayed in that situation as well. Then we've got our setup map if needed method, which just checks to see if it's already been set up. So it's checking to see if mmap is null. Remember, mmap is our Google Map variable over here. So that will be the case the first time you run the app, and if the app has been closed down and run again. And then you can see it's doing something very similar to what we usually do with find view by ID. But instead of view, it's using find fragment by ID because it's a fragment, which is a slightly different thing to a view. But as far as we're concerned, that's doing exactly the same thing and just setting mmap equal to the Google Map fragment on activitymaps.xml. So just here. Okay. And then it checks to see if that was successful. So if mmap is not null anymore, and if it was, then sets up the map. And really, this setup map is a custom method that we can use to set up the map, and there's some default code in there which adds a marker to the map. So it just creates a new marker with a position, latitude and longitude of 0, 0, and a title marker. So we'll play around with that in a few moments, but you can see it's fairly obvious what that's doing. It's just creating a marker on the map at 0, 0 with a title of marker. All right, so we haven't changed that code at all. We're leaving it all completely generic. So now time to run the app, but this is where we need to do something a little different to usual as well. And this is the same as earlier on when we specified a minimum SDK of 21. That's because we need to actually run it on the SDK of 21. If we try it on 22, you're likely to get an error. That's not to say that any apps that you create using this method won't work on real devices with an API of 22, but they won't work on the simulator. At least at the time of recording this video, that was the case. All right, now here's the box that we're used to where we launch emulator, and this is where we need to be careful and make sure that we launch the correct type of emulator. And there's two things to look for here. So I'm just going to click on the box with 3 dots. Now I've created a few emulators here because I've been testing all of this, but assuming that you've only got this one here, so a standard API 22, then you'd need to create a new virtual device, and the phone really doesn't matter, so let's stick with Nexus 5 for now. But what does matter is the version of Android that we're going to use. So depending on what you selected when you downloaded and installed Android Studio, you may have just one of these downloaded or you may have some more. Either way, there's two things you need to look for. So you need to choose one that has an API level of 21 and that has Google APIs included. So Google APIs is, as you can imagine, a bunch of APIs that work with Google systems. So here specifically, we're looking for Google Maps. So if you tried that one, for example, then Google Maps won't work because the Google APIs won't be installed on it. So that one from this list is the only one actually that would work. Oh, actually, this one here looks like that has Google APIs as well. And even that one should work. But that one and that one wouldn't because they don't have the Google APIs installed. So that's it. Just choose one that has an API level of 21 and has Google APIs somewhere in the target. Click download, and then that will download it for you, and then you'll be able to set up a new virtual device. And the one that I'm going to be using here is this one. So you can see that's API 21 target Google APIs. So if you don't get that right, then it won't work. So that's really important. Make sure you choose the correct one here. All right, now let's give it a go. And here we go. Here's our map displaying correctly. If you get an error about Google Play Services or something like that, you're probably not using the correct API version. So just go back and make sure that you've followed all the instructions correctly. So once we're here, you can see we've got our little pin on the map right there. And if I tap on that, then I get the marker string, and I get the option to navigate to it or view it in the Google Maps app as well. I can scroll around just like you normally would. One thing that the emulators don't support at the time of recording is pinch to zoom. But there's a nice little shortcut which you can use in Google Maps. It's very handy actually if you're walking around and you've only got one finger available. Then if you double tap but then hold down and then scroll up or scroll down, so scroll down to zoom in and then scroll up to zoom out, then that allows you to zoom in and out. Just like that. So practice that if you want to get your zooming in. Alright, so that's how we bring a map into our app. In the next lecture, I'll show you how to change the initial zoom levels and how we can put our pins in different places.